Awesome, thanks so much. Again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's like time out of your day, so very, very much appreciate it. And then I know that they said that they weren't gonna market themselves, but I'm gonna market them. When I was first getting started in my own career, I very much used the Mind the Product Slack, and so me getting here is because of Mind the Product and ProductTank. So it's a dream for me to be over here. Like, this is not something that I dreamed of 5, 10 years ago. Focusing on what we're gonna talk about here today, we're really going to be focusing on this concept of blitzscaling, which is a very counterintuitive concept of you want to actually let people down because that enables you to do a lot more good later, right? And so we're going to talk about like how does that concept work, why does it work that way? We're going to talk about what are like the risks of doing so, and then how we're going to mitigate those risks and when we should pivot away from blitzscaling, right? And so then that way we're going to be able to build out strategy, we're going to know exactly how to make this transition, and that way we don't burn our customer relationships, right? Just in terms of what we're gonna be covering, right, I'm gonna cover what exactly is blitzscaling, when we're gonna do it, when it stops working, and then how to actually pivot away from that. Then I'm gonna talk you through an actual company that went through blitzscaling. Like quite literally, it was part of the company's strategy. It was talked about every quarter, and like we can see what that did in practice, both the positive and the negative. So then that way you have this more nuanced view of the topic. And then I'll just open up for Q&A. Again, I'm Clement. I've been working in product for almost a decade now. So I've built a handful of products. I'm very, very passionate about building products. I'm also very passionate about teaching people product management. So this is like very much the thing that I do for fun on weekends, etc. And so in case it's helpful, I've written some books, right? I've done some courses. If that's helpful, feel free to use that, but that's not the focus today. So blitzscaling, right? And so just real quick, one of the things that we'll try to do is we'll try to get you guys a copy of these slides, so then that way you don't have to take notes, take pictures, etc., and you can just focus on the content. Feel free to just like stop me, ask questions, etc. Really what blitzscaling is this very counterintuitive approach where we're really focused on how do we maximize the number of people that we can serve? How do we maximize the amount of investment that we can gather so then we can go capture an entire market, right? And so this was very much popularized by LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman, right? And the thing that very much struck me was one of the key quotes that he has is, you have to let fires burn. That means your customer support emails don't get answered. That means that your customer success, as you're onboarding new customers, they're not being addressed. And it sounds super counterintuitive, yet it really works in these markets where you have a network effect, right? Once you are able to become the dominant brand in this given market, you can very quickly kind of take up all of the space, make sure that you've stabilized across all of that, and then provide that really high quality bar of service and provide that really strong product to be able to make that expansion, right? And so for blitzscaling, really it's all about speed, right? Like we want to go fast, 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 like it's just in the name blitzscaling. We want to grow as quickly as we can. We're not super worried about profits at all. And we are okay taking risks and inefficiencies, right? And I realize, again, this is kind of alien, because a lot of the time when we think about what is product management is, hey, we want to make sure we understand all of our different stakeholders. We want to make sure that we find a solution that works for everyone. But here, the focus is solely on how do we get to new customers, right? Because there are a lot of customers out there who just aren't getting our product right now. How do we break into these new markets? And then how do we take that and then provide the optimal product later? And so I realize this all sounds really abstract, so let's first just talk about like a company that we all know, which is Airbnb, right? So Airbnb, one of the things that they actually faced down was this clone, this threat called Wimdu, which we just don't really hear about anymore, right? And what happened is Wimdu wound up with $100 million in funding, and Airbnb said, oh no, like this is really dangerous. We're not gonna be able to offer our product if Wimdu takes up the entire market of where people go to list their properties to be able to have guests stay over for short-term stays, right? And so then Airbnb decided to blitzscale. What they did is they released feature after feature after feature, right? And these features were being released super fast, maybe not the best QA'd, but super fast. And then they were bringing on a bunch of property hosts. Hey, put your property on Airbnb, right? Without necessarily thinking through, oh, well, how do we make sure that they're gonna stick around long-term? And then they raised a bunch of money, and they opened up a bunch of EU offices, right? And so they gained a bunch of market dominance, and they quashed Wimdu. Again, we just don't hear about Wimdu. Airbnb is the place that you go to put your property up, so then that way people can stay there for a couple of days, right? But it had a lot of losses, right? Like it was super unprofitable during this time, and so that's part of that trade-off, right? And again, like Airbnb is very successful today because after it blitzscaled, then it invested in quality, right? And so you kind of hear that theme again and again as I go through this. With Uber, right, when they got product market fit, basically when, all of these people said, oh my gosh, Uber's really, really helpful, like I really want to use Uber, right? The problem is that a lot of times when you have product market fit, it's because that side of the market just like doesn't have a solution, just things are really painful, and that means that a lot of clones can jump in. And so at this point in time, Lyft and Sidecar were also jamming into Uber space. And something that you might realize is the more drivers you have for Uber, the more you can bring the cost down. The more you bring the cost down, the more riders you have for Uber. The more riders you have for Uber, the more drivers you have for Uber, right? So it's like this like network effect. And so it's really important that Uber establish dominance, right? So for them, what they did was for this 4-year period, they launched a bunch of products, right? They did a lot of like subsidies, right? Like, hey, we're gonna give you discounts, we're gonna give you free rides for like the rider side. And on the driver side, hey, we're gonna onboard you, we'll pay you thousands of dollars to stop driving taxis and start driving for Uber, right? But the problem is that they didn't actually do anything on the support side. And so if you actually look at those sources, you can see there was a ton of internal pain where just a lot of customer support agents just like weren't able to help people. People were being charged incorrectly, people couldn't get refunds, they were being paired incorrectly. All of this really scary stuff, but they needed to get into as many markets as possible rather than trying to keep a rider on for a long period of time, right? So they weren't super interested in, hey, how do I make sure that I keep Clement as an Uber rider for many, many years? It's how do I make sure that I can get San Francisco and then get like the South Bay and then like break into like all these markets and focus a lot less on each individual user, right? And so because of that, they very much became the dominant ride-hailing platform. And so like, again, we just, Sidecar doesn't exist anymore. And like a lot of people don't use Lyft anymore. And so that's because that they decided to blitzscale, right? And so there is kind of that cost-benefit ratio, right? As you remember, the problem with Uber is that it blitzscaled too fast. And then it caused a lot of problems, which is why they need to change out the CEO. And now it's a lot better, right? And so that's kind of, again, the story. Blitzscaling takes you very far, but if you don't know how to stop, that's when it gets real dangerous, and you'll see that again in the case study I'm going to show you. Cool, so I don't expect everyone's going to like memorize this slide, so please don't do that. But just real quick, right? Like blitzscaling is super helpful because once you take over a market, right, what happens is that you get these economies of scale, right? Like things become cheaper for you to offer as a product manager. And on top of that, your investors are really willing to invest more money in you, which then means that you can hire really amazing people, right? So like for a time, the dream place to work was Uber, was Airbnb, right? And so a lot of companies that blitzscale, they tend to be very well known in Silicon Valley because like they're getting all this market share, they're getting all this attention and hype. But the problem is, and we don't typically talk about this in the media, a lot of things tend to then go wrong where there's operational chaos, right? You're building things in a way that like doesn't necessarily make sense to users, or like you build stuff that's going to cause your engineers a lot of pain in like a couple of months, and these are trade-offs that you have to make if you decide to blitzscale, right? And so, because this is a thing that has pros and cons, right? Like it's not like a black and white, hey, definitely it's always going to work. Generally speaking, we want to aim at blitzscaling only right after we've got product market fit, right? So again, what is product market fit? Just real quick, it's when you have a product that solves an unmet need for a bunch of people, and then they just keep pulling the product out of your hands, right? Like, I want this product, and you can't build it fast enough. Like your support systems are crashing, you can't onboard people fast enough, your website keeps going down, right? And so when you see that, that's the time that you should be blitzscaling, right? Because basically you've got a really big market, you can distribute very easily, and you've got plenty of cash to burn to be able to capture all of these people, right? But what I want to make clear is there's definitely a time when you shouldn't be blitzscaling, and we're going to talk about a real quick other case study, and that's Quibi. So quick show of hands, how many people know what this company is? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So what this is, it's basically like long-form TikTok, and so it's like not short videos, something like videos that are like 6 to 8 minutes long. And they raised nearly $2 billion, right? And yet they crashed within a year, and none of us have heard about them, right? And the reason is because they decided to blitzscale before they had product market fit, right? Like they straight up did not know which customers are we serving, what pain are we serving, right? And so they didn't validate anything, honestly. And so they said, we're gonna build mobile-only medium-length videos, right? But a lot of people either want short videos like TikTok or like long videos like Netflix or YouTube. They're not really looking for that like weird, awkward 6 to 8 minute block, right? And they didn't really focus on like, what do our customers want? Like they were saying, hey, let's bring on new partners, let's get all of this content. But they didn't really think about, well, who's gonna be absorbing this content? Who's gonna be paying for this content, right? So they didn't do any sort of customer research. And because of what they were doing, right, they had all of these teams going out there, creating all of these different shows, and each of these people were like, wait, isn't that show exactly the same as my show? Why are we doing different things, right? So there's just all this operational strain where they just didn't know what the heck that they were doing, and that just meant that cash burned very quickly, and they shut down after 6 months, right? And so this is the kind of failure that you can have if you decide to blitzscale at the wrong time, right? Yes, what's up?
Was that the one started by HP CEO, the former HP CEO?
I believe so, yes, yeah. So again, just because you have a lot of industry experience doesn't mean that you get to skip the customer research side. You still need to understand who your customers are, whether they want it, whether they need it, and demonstrate that you actually have a solution to that, right? This is very much a solution in search of a problem, and very much not like an actual like product that solved a real gap, right? So yeah. Yeah, what's up?
So it sounds like, because I'm thinking about like Snowflake, for example, which is done really well, and you have like big personality. It sounds like one of the places to be wary of this is if you have like a big named personality who's able to just raise money because of who they are, and that's, so imagining just from what I heard that that's what happened here. Like, otherwise there's no way they would have raised $2 billion without even having a product that you know they can feel.
Yeah, personalities can tend to do that, for sure.
If they had a big success before, then they know
Yeah.
the next thing should be. They know.
They think, yeah.
I've been in a little tiny company that did that. Exactly.
I mean, Snowflake has been a pretty incredible rise, but different strategy.
And related to that, do you know the examples of B2B blitzscaling? Because it seems more straightforward with B2C because you're talking about geographical markets. It makes sense. But with B2B, what do you think is maybe an example of somebody that did it?
So the case I'm going to give you is a B2B one. Yeah, so we'll get into that in just a bit, for sure. Great question, yeah. Cool. Any other questions before I keep going? Okay, so then we talked about when to start. We also told you when not to start. So the question is, when should you stop doing it, right? And so one of the things to just keep in mind, right, is again, with blitzscaling, right, there's a lot of advantages, right? Like, let's make it very clear. Airbnb and Uber and just LinkedIn too, right? All of these really large industry-defining giants would not be around if they decided not to blitzscale. So there's definitely a reason to do it. The question is when to stop, right? And so the way to think about it is basically by using a couple of almost like common sense type signals. And so we're going to talk about a couple of them, right? And the first one is when you see that you're getting what's called diminishing marginal returns, right? It's not that, oh, if I, when I spend $1 million, I earn this much in revenue. When I spend the next $1 million, I get this much in revenue, et cetera. When you see that that's starting to fall off a cliff, that's when you know, oh, I should probably start to think of stopping, right? And so basically, let's say that when I capture 1% of new market share, right, because I'm like a new startup, it takes me like $1 million, right? Then I take another 1%, et cetera, it's like a million. At some point, the market becomes so saturated that when you try to take the next 1%, it takes you 10 million or it takes you 20 million, right? And so it becomes more and more expensive. When you start to see that expense going up a lot, that's when you should start to think, do I need to pump the brakes, right? Another one is when your customers are creating industry-wide bad public relations, right? That's when you should start thinking, ooh, we should probably stop blitzscaling, where we just keep worrying about getting new customers rather than trying to retain current customers, right? And so I think all of you have probably lived this experience. Every time you get like a new cell phone plan, they treat you really well, and then when you like renew your cell phone plan, they don't treat you very well because they don't really care if you churn or not, right? And so one of the things that you'll start to see is when you're chasing getting new customers and you find out like, oh wait, this new customer I just got used to be a customer of ours and they stopped using us for some reason, that's when you know, oh, I probably need to stop blitzscaling, right? If you're starting to see that you're burning cash really fast, right, then that's also when you should start to think, hey, should we start to slow down a little bit? And then also just when like the market's mostly captured. And so the thing that I just want to call out here is it is possible for you to wind up with one of these signals at a time, and that's like a good warning sign of, hey, we should start to consider what does it look like to pivot away from blitzscaling. But when you see 2 or more of these, that's when you really need an action plan. How are we going to stop blitzscaling, right? Because a lot of times what happens is when an organization is blitzscaling, again, like just like talking about Uber from like 2012 to 2016, when you start to blitzscale, your company's North Star metric is growth, right? And so everyone is incentivized by that. If you start asking questions about, what about NPS? What about retention? What about activation? All these things, no one's rewarded for it. In fact, they get punished for it because it's not moving growth, right? And so when you start seeing one of these signals, it's time to start talking to leadership. Hey, we should probably think about shifting what are our KPIs. By the time you're at 2 signals, if you haven't started talking about it yet, then it's going to be very hard to pivot away because everyone's so used to thinking growth, 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 growth at all costs without thinking about, but what does it mean to be profitable long term, right? So that is when to stop blitzscaling. And then so the way that we're going to do that, right, is basically we now need to start to shift away in terms of how are we measuring ourselves, what are our game plans, and start to focus more on how do we create kind of long-term profits, right? And so one of the things that I teach actually quite a lot, which I think not necessarily every product manager knows by heart, is every product manager is actually an investor, right? What do I mean by that? A product manager is like an investor in that they have limited capital. That capital is basically engineering and design bandwidth, right? Like basically you can't very easily get more engineers and more designers. And so you need to be very thoughtful about when I am working with these very precious resources, right? When I'm using these very talented people's time to try to change the world through software, right? How am I going to deploy that in a way that drives long-term return on investment? And the reason why we need to do that, the reason why we need to think that as investors and earn money for the company is because if we just make people happy, and the company doesn't earn any money, then the company goes out of business, and then no one uses your product, and then nobody's happy, right? And so if we want people to use our product for the long term, for their entire lives, we need to make sure that the product's gonna be around for a long, long time, right? And the only way for your product to be around for a long, long time is if you make sure it has the money to do that, right? Like people aren't cheap. We all want to be, we all want to live a good life and like be paid well and like feel good from our employers. And so because of that, it's important that we are able to earn revenue. We don't just focus on customer like happiness or adoption or whatever. It needs to feed into revenue somehow. And that revenue can't cost you more than the engineering effort or the marketing effort that you're putting in to get that revenue, right? And so that's the pivot. And this pivot is actually super hard. Like when I talk about it like this, it sounds like, well, Clement, that's really obvious. Duh, a company needs money, right? But surprisingly, a lot of companies that are in like blitzscale mode forget that their point is to earn money. They just think that the point is to get new customers, and that's not actually going to get them money in the long term, right? And so we really want to focus on how are we going to keep this company in business for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and keep providing that amazing product that we brought so many people on and make sure that they can use it for the rest of their lives, right? Like that's really the goal that we're looking at. And so when we do that, it's time to start to look at lowering unnecessary costs, right? And a lot of times that means, hey, we're not going to be doing all of these, A/B tests in terms of driving more activation, driving more conversion, right? It means we're not going to be doing so much marketing. It means we're not going to be giving so many kind of incentives away. And it's okay that revenue shrinks if costs go down a lot faster than that, right? So it's okay to earn less money next quarter if your costs are going down by a bunch next quarter, right? And so you really want to start thinking about what are some of the products that I can build that will help us be more profitable by helping us, enable our operations to be a lot more stable. On top of that, we really want to focus on product quality, right? One of the things that I want to talk about real quick from like an investor mindset is basically there's this particular metric that investors think about, which is like, it's customer lifetime value divided by customer acquisition cost. So like, what do I mean by all of that stuff? Customer lifetime value just means, hey, like how much is this person worth when they hang out with my company for like a long, long time? And then customer acquisition cost is like, how much do I need to pay in marketing and engineering, all that stuff to get this person to come to us for the first time, right? And a lot of times when you're blitzscaling, you straight up don't care about either of those metrics. You don't care how much it costs to get that person, and you don't care how much money that person's gonna earn you. Once you start to move into sustainable growth mode, you have to make sure that you're not spending more money than what this person's going to help your company generate so you can stick around for the long term, right? So it's really important that we start thinking about how do we help this person do more with our product and increase customer lifetime value? And how do we reduce that customer acquisition cost and make sure that they stick around? And one of the best ways to reduce customer acquisition cost is to make people actually want to use your product, right? Like I know that that sounds crazy, but again, like let's talk cell phone plans, or like let's talk credit cards, right? Like who here has gotten a credit card in the offer, in the mail, and it's like, hey, if you switch to us, you're gonna get all of these benefits, and then you switch. Just quick show of hands. How many people have like actually like done that like credit card swap? A couple people, right? And so like for banks, right, for them, they're trying to get you to switch all the time because it's like, well, we don't really need to like keep our current customer base, but that's the problem because if you kept your current customer base, you wouldn't have to pay to get those new customers, right? So you want your current customer base to be loyal. And so it's really important that you start to focus on customer feedback, right? A lot of blitzscaling companies, they just straight up stop listening to the customers because it's like new market, new market, new market. Well, no, now you need to keep people around for 3 years, 5 years, et cetera, rather than letting them churn after 2 months, right? So this is also a really big deal. And then the third really big deal, and again, like this will feel very alien to people who have blitzscaled, is we should help our teammates, which again sounds really crazy. Of course we should help our teammates, right? But when you're so used to treating sales teams, marketing teams, customer support teams as just like, oh, these are just like necessary evils, rather than people who actually keep customers staying with us for the long run, right? That's when things start to fall apart. Because again, at some point, the point of blitzscaling is not to just keep growing. You want to then stop so you can actually start to capture some of those profits and stick around for the long term. Like that's really the point, right? So I'm just gonna pause here. Any questions in terms of this like mental model shift and why that shift can sometimes be very difficult for folks who are used to blitzscaling? What's up?
Well, my question is more, it's related to that, but have you seen examples of companies that caused so much damage on their path of blitzscaling by forgetting things and or making decisions that were really hard to undo once they decided now it's time to stabilize and where they weren't able to stabilize?
I think you might get a flavor of that in the case study I'm gonna talk through, I think. But definitely when you go from like blitzscaling to then like trying to like stop blitzscaling, like there's definitely a period of time when it's just like, it's all pain, right? Because it's like, your company's not getting more customers right now, and your current customers are still really mad at you for not listening to them for the last like 3 to 5 years, right? And so that point is the point at which it's very, very painful, but it's a necessary debt to pay down, because then that way you become this long-term presence in the industry that provides that value to people over the long run. So yeah, I would hazard to say just about every company that has blitzscaled has gone through that. It's just a question of how public in the media it was or not, I would say, yeah. Because I know like, as an example, even for Airbnb, which again, is like generally speaking a decently well-regarded organization, they've definitely had a lot of problems around like, oh, like there's a lot of like fake listings, there's a lot of bot listings, there's a lot of fake reviews, etc. People who like go to these places, the hosts like fake that like this is the listing, like you get swapped to another listing, you can't get a refund, there's all these pain, and like there's all this like customer attrition that happens. And at some point when that becomes too noisy, that's when it's like, oh, we need to stop doing this, we need to start investing in quality again, right? So there's definitely, I think there's definitely instances just about every blitzscaling company, it's just a question of how public it was, so yeah. Yeah.
It's an opportunity to fail as well at that point, right? I would think that. Do you know about companies that have blitzscale and not being able to make this pivot?
That was my question.
Yeah, and so they exist, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I think there are quite a few that's just like they become so big, and then at some point they just go bankrupt because it's like they just can't keep going. And so I think it's almost like a testament to how I literally can't remember any of their names, of like how forgettable they were, of just like there's so many companies that get featured in TechCrunch or get featured in like Hacker Noon or on Y Combinator or whatever, and like big. But at some point when they create so much negative goodwill from their own customers and they can't stay in business and they suddenly shut down, right? Like that happens so frequently. Yeah, and you just don't remember them. And so I literally can't cite one right now because they were just too forgettable.
There's some that I'm sure I've signed up for some and I can't remember them either.
Right, exactly. Like it definitely, I think if you told me or Nils, right, like, oh, like these companies were the ones that failed, we'd be like, oh yeah, those guys. But like right now we're just like, who? Right? And so that's, again, like the danger of blitzscaling without knowing when to stop, right? Is you wind up killing off the company and then just not making that long-term impact in the world that you wanted. So yeah. And again, like, sorry, I'm just gonna finish this up and I'm gonna ask you. So I think actually a good example is WeWork, actually, now that I think about it. And so with WeWork, they were very much kind of blitzscaling in terms of we're gonna bring on all these properties, property. But they didn't really think about, well, how are we gonna make sure that people actually want to be in a WeWork over the long run? What's that like long-term sustainable strategic value? And then they died, right? And so like that's like a very good example. And so, there are definitely organizations like WeWork who run into the exact same problem. So yeah.
That sounds like a great one. Great example.
Okay.
LTV over CAC and deceleration of growth. These are the two things that we touched on. Are there
Yes.
any other things that somebody should be watching for before they stop listening?
Yeah, great question. Again, so I think we go back real quick. Those are like two pretty good signals, right? Of like you're seeing deceleration of growth, like LTV over CAC is like still bad and not improving in any sort of way. Again, I would just say if you're starting to see that, when you start to see that a lot of customers refuse to sign up because other people are saying this org sucks, that's about when you're like, oh, we should start to invest in quality again. And so I'd say that's like the qualitative version of that. I know it sounds very unscientific, but honestly kind of like understanding the vibes, I guess, of like your organization out there is actually quite valuable. I think one of the things that we talk about a lot as like product people is like, oh, we really want to make sure that we really understand metrics and not like, oh, metrics are like the holy grail. But I actually want to refute that. And I know that this is blasphemy because I'm an ex-product analyst. Like I did data analytics for my living. Like that's how I got paid. The problem is that every metric that you ever have is simply some proxy for the real world where messy human beings are making messy decisions with other messy human beings to try to figure out like what are we doing in the world, right? And so because of that, at some point, metrics only doesn't really tell you how people are thinking or feeling or like how they're making those decisions, right? It doesn't tell you the why, exactly. Like it shows you the how much and it shows you the what, but it doesn't tell you the why at all. And so you might see, oh, you know, LTV over CAC is like, you know, is very much like flipped over. And it's like, oh, well, that makes sense because they're like bringing people on. But like the question is, oh, well, actually, is the LTV side shrinking specifically? And if so, is that because people are like, hey, the vibes of this company aren't good, I don't want to use them anymore, right? And so like, you know, with Netflix, I'm sure a lot of you have canceled your Netflix subscriptions, like my wife and I recently did, because it's just like, what's the long-term value of this when there are so many other platforms out there, right? And so that's when that LTV gets cut off, even though they're continuing to like, you know, spend in terms of CAC, right? And again, Netflix is not in like the blitzscaling business anymore, right? But just like something to check for is when you see that like the vibes are off, of like people just aren't really interested in your product anymore, that's when you know, oh, something is starting to go wrong. It's important that we make sure that we keep our current customers for life, right? Because that then improves LTV without having to spend a bunch on CAC, right? So hopefully that makes some sense.
That's actually very true because at the end of the day, it's not just the equations and the metrics. We gotta look at the intangibles.
Right.
Exactly. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
How about in this case, fast followers? So in the case of Uber, they're spending a tremendous amount of money, but they had lifting in the market, who would seem to be like learning from their mistakes and following them very quickly. Is that also something to keep track of as far as like monitoring competition, monitoring the market, to see if something like drafting and just going, okay, I'm not going to make that mistake. Like, almost like when Apple comes in late, but they come in and learn the market from first movers.
Yeah.
People are overspending, but then coming in second, it's like they call it's like master's cheese. Is that also a consideration in this blitzscaling?
Yeah, so I think again, like it's very, I wouldn't call it like a science per se. It really depends on just like the different factors that you have on hand, right? And so if you're in a place where like network effects dominate everything, right? So like as an example, like say Amazon Prime and like e-commerce, right? When network effects dominate everything, say like SpaceX for like for like shipping into space, right? When they dominate everything, then you should consider blitzscaling. When they don't dominate everything, which is many, many other kinds of organizations, to be clear, right? Like not every organization needs to blitzscale, right? In places where the network effect is not a huge deal, second mover advantage is actually really helpful because exactly like you said, like you skip all the mistakes because you see all of them already committed, right? And so one of the places that I actually think is a really good example, and I'm actually gonna shout out Christina in terms of real estate, is in real estate. Real estate's hyper local, right? Like a real estate product is a very like local by local product where you don't need the whole market to be quite profitable and quite sustainable. And so many times, you don't need to be the person that builds the best CRM or the best closing tool or whatever. You can wait for other people to screw up and then come in your own particular market, right? And so I think another example is, and this will sound crazy, but in terms of a lot of like blockchain type products, there's just like a lot of mistakes being made out there, and like there's not really that big of a network effect. And so you can wait for people to screw up first and then build your own, right? And so it's totally okay to wait if you know that the network effect is not like the primary driver of product growth. But if it is, then you need to consider blitzscaling, even if you're going to be the one eating all those very costly mistakes. So
you're saying you wouldn't blitzscale as a second mover, you wouldn't blitzscale because the first mover had already maybe done that, and it would be unwise to try and do it as a second mover.
Yeah, exactly. If you see a first mover already blitzscaling, then kind of they're committed to like, we're gonna take like a very big chunk and we're okay losing a bunch of people. Then as a second mover, you can look at how do we keep all of the unhappy later people and make sure that they're happy and they stick with us for the long run. So then when the first one runs out of growth, you're already there in terms of profits, right? And so there's one of the things that like I teach in terms of like my product strategy like courses is there's no such thing as a perfect product strategy. Every strategy is simply multiple defensible choices and you just have to pick one, right? And so it's very defensible for you to choose to be second mover, long-term defensible, and just not do blitzscaling. That's a very okay move to make. The hard part is making sure that you commit to it, right? And so very much strategy is not like there's only one right way to do it. It's making sure that you pick the one that you want to do and then you stick to it and you make sure that like, you keep executing on it while everyone else questions your decisions, right? Like that's the hard part of product strategy, yeah.
A great example for that one is Temu versus Amazon.
Exactly, yeah. Cool, these are excellent questions. Anything else I want to talk about? Yeah, what's up?
So, are there like phases where you blitzscale and then you normalize and then you again?
So usually you wouldn't like blitzscale normalize blitzscale because a lot of times when you blitzscale, that's the one that you're doing that in the market where you have like this like product market fit and you're basically like establishing a name for yourself. Basically once you have that, every other product that you have adjacent to that doesn't really require blitzscaling. Because you already have like, you already have a strong network, you already have a strong brand. And so again, just like use Uber, because we just talked about Uber. Uber Eats did not really need a blitz scaling strategy. They did, but they didn't need it because like people already know Uber and that adjacency makes some sense. And then they tried to blitz scale like Uber Freight and like that just basically didn't go anywhere because it's like that's not the same kind of market at all. And so you can see when someone tries to like force the same lesson into all the wrong product contexts, it just stops working. So like Uber Freight just straight up doesn't work that way, even though Uber Eats does and just didn't need to be blitz scaled, right? So like that's kind of how I would think about that. Yeah, generally speaking, the hardest part of any company's life cycle is getting into its first market. As soon as you have the first market, you can very quickly find the next product market fit. Again, like I have this like whole other talk, so I've done like 70 talks. And so like there's a whole other talk I do on product market fit where it's like getting your first one's very hard because you need to have like a good, you need to know the market, the pain, and the solution all at the same time. And if you get one of them wrong, you screwed up, right? And it's much easier being a company who already has customers because you already know who your customers are. And so now all you need is the pain and the solution to fit, right? And so it's like way easier to do your second product, third product, et cetera, rather than trying to figure out the first one, right? So like, again, just like being very honest, when I like put up like my intro slide of like, hey, like I've shipped 14 multi-million-dollar products, none of them were like first product market fit products. They were all like second products or third products, et cetera, for organizations that already had product market fit, right? And so many times you can have a lot of success after an org has had product market fit in terms of getting your next products out and building out that portfolio, building out that platform. Getting the first one, that's when you need to decide if you're gonna blitzscale or not, so yeah. These are all great questions. Nicely done. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, so it comes with like market, customers, and pay. So even if you solve, bring a solution for the pains and resolving the customer pain point, then also it comes the product adoption. That customers should use your product, that how you go about with that your product should reach maximum customers having the similar pains.
So I think that is much more like, I think asking that question means you don't have product market fit, right? Because if you have product market fit, your customers will naturally take your product because it solves so much of their pain that they don't care how hard it is to adopt, right? And so generally like a good way to see like product market fit is people are like so hair on fire, like the problem is so bad that they will take your product and they don't care how bad the product is or like how messed up the UX is. If you're asking questions about product adoption, you're probably already like working on a mature product and not one that just got product market fit, right? And so that's how I think about it. It's like almost two totally separate mindsets. And so I wouldn't necessarily put those two together, if that makes sense. And we can like talk afterwards. It's just like, I want to make sure that, I think we've got 10 minutes left. And so I want to make sure that we can go through some of the case study stuff so that you can actually see that B2B example and like see how all of that played out. So yeah.
You can take it.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Cool. Then I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to talk about a publicly traded fintech business-to-business, software as a service, right? Very much focused in tackling digital mortgage applications. There's not only one organization like this, there are quite a few like this. But for this particular one, its key customers were folks like Wells Fargo, US Bank, et cetera. And they definitely had product market fit, right? Basically, in 2017, customers were trying to shove the product into all these places that they shouldn't be using the product, where they were like, hey, this is like a digital mortgage. We're going to use it for digital credit cards. Like, what? Like, why would you do that? Or like, oh, like we're going to use this for like digital whatever. And so they're trying to use the product in all these ways that they shouldn't be using it. And they kept saying, hey, we're willing to pay you. Like, we're willing to pay you all this money, even though you've not even built this product yet, because we really, really, really need it, right? And so there was a really strong willingness to pay and a really strong desire for, hey, once you build this for us, we're actually going to go out there and do these conferences and say, look at how innovative we are. We partnered with this particular startup to build this amazing new innovative experience, and we are willing to do all this free marketing, right? And so very clearly there's product market fit, right? And so the asks were, hey, right now, there's this digital application on the borrower side, but what about all the loan officers that are actually intaking these applications when they're like, working inside like a branch, or like when they're trying to take an application over the phone, right? So let's build out this digital workflow for lenders. And then also, please, 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 people don't come to banks to just do mortgages. They come to banks to do all these other things. They're trying to get credit cards, they're trying to do auto loans, all this other stuff, right? And so we would love nothing more than for you to build all of these different things, right? So this was kind of like the point at which this organization could make a decision. Either we blitzscale or we don't, right? And so what they decided to do is they decided to blitzscale, right? And so the way that they did that was basically they launched all of these different products very quickly, right? These products were not necessarily the most, let's say, delightfully built ones or the ones that were the most technically scalable. A lot of them were more like, we're going to hard code this thing in. We're going to like move this thing around. We're going to duplicate code in these services. We're going to use a monolith. All of these things that were not necessarily the smartest, but enabled this organization to very quickly bring on all of these customers, right? You can see right over there, market leadership. Within 1 year, right, they brought on 20 new logos, which is nearly unheard of in banking. And then within another year, they won another 30 logos across all of these different consumer loans, like credit cards and auto loans and personal loans, right? And because of that, then this organization was promoted by these like huge giants in banking, which then caused all of the other banking people to be like, well, we should use that too if they're already saying that they're going to use it, right? And so there's this like domino effect that's going through the market. And then that then drove this team and revenue growth, right? Basically, the product engineering design headcount was doubled. The go-to-market team in terms of like sales was tripled. And they hit this like magical $100 million ARR in 2019, 1 year after that like home equity one, and like around the time of like the consumer loans. And because of that, they kept doing this, right? And they did this over and over again for years, right? And so it's like, this is definitely going to be a success story, right? Like there's definitely not going to be a downside, right? Like all the foreshadowing I've done so far, there's definitely no problem with this, right? Well, no, it stopped working. Places where it stopped working is once you bring on all of these really, really large banks, employ tens of thousands of people. And all of these people need to be trained on new workflows, and they have existing tools that they're using. And so you can't just bring a new tool into a big organization. You gotta like train people, you gotta configure it, you gotta integrate it. And so the problem is that before, because this organization was blitzscaling, they were saying, hey, we're gonna get into each of these new logos, and we're gonna get set up and get into production in 2 to 3 weeks. And that just wasn't happening. It was taking like 6 months, 12 months, et cetera, because there's so many things that people weren't able to do because these deployment specialists were getting spread thin across all of these gigantic logos who had very, very clear requirements that this organization wasn't able to meet. On top of that, the lender users, they were using personal loans and credit cards and mortgages, et cetera, and they were just, why do all these user experiences look different? And so they just said, hey, borrowers, don't even bother using this particular product. Just call me, just come into the office, right? Like, just don't use this digital product anymore. And that caused revenue loss for this organization, and it caused really bad experiences for consumers. Like, they went back into the bad old ages because the actual employees trying to use the product weren't able to like adopt it. And then just like the diminishing returns were very real here. So as this organization broke into each new vertical, yes, right, like it unlocked additional market share, et cetera, But at some point, it started to fall apart because each one had their own go-to-market team, marketing campaigns, profit and loss statements, and that like fragmentation just meant that for each large organization that said, hey, we're going to use all these different things that you said, right? Like personal loans and home equity lines of credit and mortgages, et cetera. Which one do we start with first? And of course, the company said, well, all of them. And like, we don't work that way. You got to start with one of them first. And it's like, well, why not just try all of them? And just like, it was very much talking past each other, you know? And so this created a lot of challenges. They continued to blitzscale, even after they had IPO'd. And within a 12-month period, that stock price crashed by 7x, right? And so like, ow, that's real painful. And so that's a very clear story of why you shouldn't keep blitzscaling. And so like, how did this organization even get out of blitzscaling mode? Well, thankfully, investors are going to ask you the hard question. How are you going to earn me money in the long run, right? If the product team's not going to be an investor, we, the investors, are investors. How are you going to earn me money in the long run, right? And so the investor said, hey, this is straight up not working. We demand change. And leaders started to leave the organization. The leaders who said every quarter, our goal is to blitzscale. Like quite literally in those like all hands, in those strategy documents, blitzscale, those leaders left the organization. A new set of leaders were brought in by investors who want profits, right? And it's like, we should focus on profits, right? And so let's stop trying to get new logos. Let's just really focus on the logos that we have. Let's make sure that we make them really successful. Let's focus, let's build, let's really make sure that we have much stronger internal processes, we have a lot more scalability, we have a lot more velocity, let's like pay down the tech debt. And so, thankfully, after a period of time in which the stock price was depressed, this new focus meant that stock prices went back up by 6x over an 18-month period, right? Definitely not nowhere, like it's nowhere near the heights, but you can see that very clearly once you stop blitzscaling and you start focusing on profitability at the time that it makes sense, your stock price will reflect that, right? And so it's like a very clear study, right? Where actually, if this organization had decided to stop blitzscaling right after IPO, or even just right before IPO, that would have been the right call to keep the momentum and make sure that they could continue to build these amazing products and not have to wait until this point to grow stock prices and first have to get through that really difficult point, right? Like if this organization had the harder conversations earlier, it's likely that this entire financial pain would not have happened. So I'm gonna pause there because that is the case study. Any questions about how this showed up? Anything that I didn't describe clearly enough? Yeah, what's up?
I love the mystery that we didn't tell the name of the company yet.
I'm not gonna share that, unfortunately. But yeah.
It's a cautionary tale.
It's a cautionary tale.
This
And
one was able, but it, you know, wouldn't have been as good as if you told us a story where it just completely crashed and burned. So this one was able to kind of stop it before it was too late.
exactly. And so this one was not.
So going back to what you said earlier, what you're saying is they either ignored or didn't pay attention to those factors that they should have been looking at that told them like now's time to stop.
And so like one of the things that
Ego was that like, you know, we're just like in it, like no, we're going, baby.
yeah, so I'm not close enough, so I'm not able to like I don't know there.
Yeah.
But what I do know, at least from a product perspective, is like for a long time, there was not a product pillar in terms of, again, anytime you do enterprise B2B SaaS, there's a lot of work that you need to do to get your product into that organization. You have to train everyone on it, you have to integrate it with all these different tools. And for the longest time, there was not a product strategy around that. One of the key turning points was actually having like a team focus on like, we will build this functionality to enable this entire part of like the adoption process to get faster and actually hit those 2 to 3 weeks that they were aiming for, rather than those 6 to 12 months of like stretching for long periods, right? And so that definitely was an area of focus, which makes sense because like when you don't have your customer deployed, you're burning kind of all of this time where you're not getting the revenue from them, and you have all this headcount that's like kind of not doing anything because they're blocked by not having the software to do it. And so that really enabled kind of better margins and earlier recognition of revenue, and like, oh, well, great, that helps with profitability. So yeah.
Is this company still, or did they make the market leadership in their space?
So this particular organization is one of the market leaders in this particular space. I believe the market share is something like 30% of all mortgages flow through this organization. And so they're definitely one of a couple of very large names in this particular market, but they're not the only one. So yeah. Yeah, and so there was a mini network effect specifically over here. When you're in enterprise B2B, one of the things that happens a lot is like people follow other people in terms of if you have a really big logo, that really big logo drives other logos to also adopt it because it's like, oh, it's a safe thing to do because everyone else is doing that. It's already been like kind of pre-vetted. And so that was the network effect that this organization exploited as it was going after blitzscaling. Yeah, and so it definitely still has like a major presence in the market, even during the crash. Like to be quite clear, even at this point, it still held a large plurality, basically, of that market of somewhere between, I think it was between like 20 to 40% of all mortgages and a good chunk of consumer loans. Even though the stock price was down, and even though they weren't making money, they still were able to keep those logos because in enterprise, again, orgs tend to not like churning. If they've churned, you've done something really, really terrible. And so it's more, hey, we're not happy that this isn't working, but we're gonna stick around and like hope it turns around. And it did turn around, and that's what enabled the stock to go back up, so yeah.
Were they first in market in digitizing mortgages, or were they a little late in opportunity to do better?
I think, so digitizing mortgages is actually a very, it's a multifaceted problem. There are multiple points at which you can digitize a mortgage. And so in some parts you can be first mover, and in some parts you are like later mover. And so digitizing and streamlining the consumer experience, this organization was the first, but they were not the first to do so on the lender side. They were also not the first to do so, let me think. They were not the first to do so in mortgage closings, right? So like there's a mortgage application, then there's a mortgage processing, then there's underwriting, then there's close. And so there's each of these different like wedges within the process. So they're first to market on borrower application, but they weren't first to market on many of these other steps downstream. And so then other players were able to wedge themselves down there and then be able to also hold a presence. And so that particular market is very interesting because each of these large players were first to market on their one part, but were late to market on the others because like you only have so many resources, you can't be first on all of them. And so because of that, they have their own kind of like, fiefdoms, I guess, or their own little like kingdoms where like they control like this space, the other one controls this space, the other one controls that space, and that's kind of how that market has panned out. And then the rest is very much like long tail, very small organizations, so yeah. Okay, cool. Well, it sounds like we're wrapped up here. It is 7:51. I want to be respectful of your time. I know that you all have spent a long evening listening to me blather on, so hopefully this was helpful. Anything else before I hand it back over to our organizers here?
You have a quick recap slide. Feel free to go through that.
Indeed. So again, just to recap, blitzscaling, very helpful, also very dangerous, right? So you need to know when to use it and then when to stop using it. It's all about product market fit. It's all about understanding what is it that our customers want and need and making sure that then they do that. You need to know when to stop. No strategy should be used forever, right? We want to think about, hey, when has the market changed? When is our operations changing where we should be rethinking all of this stuff? And then again, as product people, right, why did we get into the business of doing product? The goal is that we're trying to get rid of pain. Like that has always been the goal, right? And so blitzscaling enables us to get in front of a lot of people very quickly, and then we want to eliminate that pain, right? We're not in the business of just getting in front of a bunch of people and then inflicting more pain. That wasn't why we got here, right? And so blitzscaling is so the thing I want y'all to keep in mind, right, is as product people, our job is to maximize positive impact in the world, right? And that means that there's two dimensions. One dimension is breadth, how many? Another dimension is depth, how deep, right? Blitzscaling helps you optimize on the breadth component, right? So you can reach a lot of people very quickly, but it doesn't help you with depth. And so once you've run out of breadth, it's time to start going down deep. The flip side is if you only do depth, sometimes you're not able to stick around long enough as an organization to eventually reach all the people that you want to reach and to change their lives for the better that way, right? And so in certain cases, blitzscaling is the necessary evil you need to take to be able to get that breadth so that you can optimize for depth later and maximize your impact as a product person. So think not in months, but in years as you think about what is that long-term trajectory of my product strategy. And that is everything. Thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.